The Ann Chu show at White Columns closed before most of the Sculpture Forum crew had a chance to see it, but I saw it. I found my way over to Horatio Street, headed west until I came to the gallery. I accidentally caught Matthew Higgs, the director of White Columns, leaving the gallery on his way to walk his dog. The show was small, very simply, beautifully put together. Ann Chu was a very smart, daring, wonderful sculptor who died in 2016. She was just 57. The gallery hopes their show might inspire a bigger show somewhere else in the future. I hope so too. I never met Ann Chu. I'm not an art critic, certainly not any kind of Ann Chu scholar or expert, but I saw the show. I have some thoughts. At the show, my first stop was the piece titled Procession Burial. I'd seen flower drawing number 1, the ceramic vase with artificial flowers at the entrance to the show. I'd seen that years ago at the Brooklyn Museum. So I kind of jumped to Procession Burial. It's a 3-piece piece. An over life-sized head on the floor, a large, surprisingly haunting set of canvas storage bags, or boxes hanging from the ceiling and containing mostly emptiness, but also a plastic-looking, but not plastic, life-size, big rat. And finally, a more or less life-size figure. I don't think Procession Burial is a completely finished piece, but I don't know. A critic, Jonathan Goodman in Sculpture magazine, wrote about a connection between the figure in Procession Burial and Bernini angels. Yes, both Ann's figure and Bernini angels have wings, but are they really alike? I might say Ann's figure is much stiffer than a Bernini. Maybe suggest a connection to an early Renaissance figure instead, maybe a Donatello. But wait a minute, a Donatello? It's strange how easy it is to connect Ann's awkward, flimsy, but striking figure to a Bernini, a Donatello. What does that say about sculpture? About what many people call figure sculpture? About the moment we call now. I first heard about Ann Chu from Bruce Gagne, a sculptor, friend, teacher, hero of mine, maybe 25, maybe 30 years ago. I forget what show he wanted his students to see, but I remember his enthusiasm. I saw it in his face. I don't remember talking to him about where it came from. And I remember being disappointed, puzzled really, by the work I saw in the show. The work just wasn't work I could embrace wholeheartedly. But for some reason it stuck with me. I kept an eye out for Ann's shows. For some reason I associate the time Bruce told me about Ann Chu with his talking enthusiastically about native North American art. Maybe in one of his lunchtime art history lectures at the studio school. I started to pay more attention to that stuff too. But again, I was often puzzled. In many ways it was a foreign language. Then, I forget exactly when or where, I came across some of Ann's bears. The bears weren't really lifelike, but I felt there was some kind of life or spirit inside them. At least I felt that Ann was trying to get some spirit, some life into them. Maybe she didn't succeed completely, but she was trying. And she wasn't trying to make something that just looked like native North American art. What might be called the tone of her bear sculptures was complex. There was irony, a comic dimension, along with straightforward seriousness, power. There was never a simplistic God is dead message. I had no trouble connecting her work to native North American art then, and to the spiritual dimension in that work. I could see Georg Baselitz and Marcus Lupertz in Ann's work too. But Ann seemed to be a more complicated artist, maybe just a more confused artist than Baselitz and Lupertz. Ann seemed to be looking for meaning and not satisfied without it, often just not satisfied. She never seemed pleased with herself in the way Baselitz and Lupertz often seem pleased with themselves. There are many other contemporary sculptors whose work might be associated with Ann's: Huma Baba, Katharina Fritsch, Rebecca Warren, to name just three. But Ann's work is less professional, commercial. It's more daring. I'm not an art critic. I'm not really interested in how Ann might fit into the current scene, how her work might fit in. This is just my very narrow personal take on Ann's work. Really just some not very precise memories triggered by the White Columns show. I guess I discovered Raymond Mason around 2003 when his book, At Work in Paris, came out. I like to tell my English sculptor friends that Mason was the greatest English sculptor of the 20th century, even though Mason spent most of his life in Paris. My English sculptor friends aren't amused. My guess, again, just a guess, is Ann never knew about Mason. He never really caught on in the States, though his great The Crowd was out in New York City for many years. But Mason's work helped me with Ann's. I remember walking over to, I guess it was 55th Street, just east of Madison, to see The Crowd. The sculpture was not well sighted. It was just plain hard to see. But I remember the feeling of uplift, the thrill, really, of seeing Mason's funny-looking people advancing, tumbling toward me. I felt lifted up and grounded at the same time. The Crowd is a real sculpture. The world we live in is embraced. It isn't left out. I felt something like the same thing encountering Ann's work. There are plenty of differences between Ann's work and Mason's, but what they share is more important. They were both interested in life, in investigating life through sculpture. They were both as interested in life as they were in sculpture art for its own sake, though they were both diligent artists. Mason was especially diligent, and it seems could be slapdash at times. In 2006, she published a book of watercolors / drawings called Modes, Manners, and Monsters. On the back cover of the book, Ann wrote, "These drawings are based on a 4-volume set of books titled Modes and Manners, a work by Max von Bonn that uses artworks from the Middle Ages through the 18th century to illustrate European fashion and mannerisms of each respective century." Ann was interested in the whole wide world. She did her research, though her watercolors are more like lyric poems than research notes. Maybe she didn't have Mason's patience, his doggedness. Mason worked more like a novelist, spending years working single-mindedly on one project, then another big but very different project. Just to push this novelist business a bit, I think of Mason as a Tolstoy-like novelist, a guy looking out at the world. I think of Ann as more of a Dostoevsky, someone who takes the world into her head and works with it there. Ann's figures are often puppet-like or doll-like. Max von Bonn, the guy who wrote Modes and Manners, also wrote a book called Puppets and Automata. I'm sure Ann read the famous essays about dolls and puppets by Rilke and Kleist and others. Were all these ideas fully assimilated in her work? I don't know. Were these ideas metaphysical or ontological? Don't ask me. But a nice big retrospective of Ann's work might help us think through this stuff. I might just add something potential curators of an Ann Chu retrospective might not know. Ann showed up at the opening of one of Bruce Gagne's shows. Also, for a stretch, Bruce and Ann worked with the same foundry. Ann didn't talk to Bruce at the opening. Was she just shy? Was she rushing off to another opening? Was she intimidated by his work? Horrified by it? She seems to have been a deeply curious person, a hungry person. I certainly see some of Bruce shared interests, if not direct influence, in Ann's work. Back to White Columns. There were quite a few watercolors in the show, pairs of watercolors from a series called Burial of the Sardine, and some watercolor collages from another series called Rubric Study. I wish I understood these things better. The Burial of the Sardine title is taken from a painting by Goya, what seems to be a marvelous painting that I also wish I understood better. The pairs consist of images that might seem to be taken from details in the Goya painting and images of differently colored stripes. I can feel Ann willing the two images together, but that's as far as I can go. I mentioned the kind of suspicious connection Jonathan Goodman made between Ann's Procession burial figure and Bernini angels earlier. I'd like to suggest an even more suspicious connection between Ann and Rodin, or between the burlap wrap on the standing figure in Ann's Procession burial and the robe Rodin's Balzac wears. We all know what's underneath the robe in Balzac, a very male genius, comically, tragically bursting with confidence, despair. What's underneath Ann's burlap wrap? Something closer to Petrushka, a sad clown? But the figure has those wings. It's an angel, too. And the burlap wrap also connects with two other very mysterious cloth pieces in Ann's show, Pisces Underwater and Underwater Rattus. I've heard Ann was a keen diver, but I certainly can't explain these pieces. Maybe Rilke can. Here's a passage pulled from Rilke's essay on dolls. I do not dare to think of a certain pearl, in which the uncertain nature of its subaqueous world had gained such heightened spiritual significance that the whole inscrutability of destiny seemed to utter its lament in that innocent pearl drop. I pass over the intimate, the touching, the deserted, thoughtful aspect of many things, which, as I passed them, moved me deeply by their beautiful participation in human living. That's it for Rilke, but we need to think more about the marvelous sculpture Ann left behind. Now, a footnote. I just read Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse for the first time. I read it in a class led by Rachel Cohen. Rachel lives in Chicago. The class was administered by the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan. I never left my apartment in Brooklyn. Rachel's class was great. Rachel is pretty cool. Look her up. But what was really amazing for me was that in class number 3, last Thursday, Rachel was talking about the novel and about Cézanne and Roger Fry. And then, suddenly, it seemed to me, she might have been talking about Ann Chu. The first hint of Ann Chu came when Rachel pulled this phrase from Fry's little book on Cézanne. The spirit is bound to reconstruct its shelter. Rachel said that might be an epigraph for Woolf's novel. It certainly helps me think about all the work in Ann Chu's show. But it was when Rachel started talking about Mrs. Ramsay's shawl that Ann's sculpture, Pisces underwater and underwater Rattus in particular, stepped out onto center stage for me. Mrs. Ramsay is one of the main characters in To the Lighthouse. In the first part of the novel, she drapes her shawl over a boar's skull, hanging in a room where some of her children sleep. She's hiding the skull to allow a child who's frightened by the skull to get to sleep. In the second part of the novel, Mrs. Ramsay has died. The summer house, where everyone was staying in part 1, has been abandoned. Rachel called attention to this moment. Nothing, it seemed, could break that image, corrupt that innocence, or disturb the swaying mantle of silence which, week after week, in the empty room, wove into itself the falling cries of birds, ships hooting, the drone and hum of the fields, a dog's bark, a man's shout, and folded them around the house in silence. Once only a board sprang on the landing. Once in the middle of the night with a roar, with a rupture, as after centuries of quiescence, a rock rends itself from the mountain and hurtles crashing down into the valley. One fold of the shawl had loosened and swung to and fro. Rachel sees the shawl as a landscape, portrait, and still life all at once. Someone else in Rachel's class said the shawl was a still life of sounds. I wonder if Anne was thinking of Mrs. Ramsay's shawl when she made Pisces underwater and underwater Rattus. Are they sculptures? Are they poems? I don't know. But they mean more to me, thanks to Rachel Cohen's class on To the Lighthouse.